So the story, the book, before when I saw the book was released in 2020, February 2020, and I take a step back to tell you why the book became important in the last 2 years. So it was launched in 2020, and it became a book of COVID because it sort of we walked into COVID with the release of the book, and then the book wasn't, initially there was a lockdown. So the book essentially sold a lot through Amazon, through Flipkart, through online platforms. And, what happened is that in March, India and China went into a standoff at Galwan. We've been reading in the newspapers, that's been on for a long time now. Many rounds of talks haven't broken the deadlock. So the book became the one reference during that time about an India-China tussle where India had prevailed over China and had established half a century of peace. And I'll come to all of that. How did that happen? Why did that happen? The impact of it all and the stories that were involved. So this book became very important as a reference point from March 2020 onwards, given the conditions, given the political climate and the conditions between India and China. And thereon, it's been continuing to be so. The start of the book, and I go back to that as one of the essential features in most of my talks. And I've been talking about the book for the last 2 years. Somewhere I talk about certain facets of the book. Sometimes I talk about the stories. Sometimes I talk about the leadership part of the book. Two weeks back, I was in Kalimpong and I was talking about the leadership facets of the book to an army division headquarters, which had invited me to speak there. And certain places I've been speaking about the political ramifications of the 1967 events that really bore its weight on history that followed. So the book came about in 2017 under similar circumstances. And what happened was the Doklam incident had taken place at that point of time where India and China were again in a state of standoff. And I realized that in the media everywhere, there was talk about how 1962 had happened and how India had suffered reverses, how there was a debacle of 1962. And I thought that, we seem to have forgotten that we had actually won 2 successive battles against China. When I checked with my friends, including army officers, including historians, very few people were actually aware of these battles. The other surprising thing was that there was no book, there was no story that had been written, that had been published about these battles of 1967 and the events around these battles, which shaped the history of the subcontinent. And we are talking about 1/3 of the world's population, two of the more important economies in the world. And we hadn't spoken about it for over 50 years. So I thought this was an idea whose time had come. I started to write the book. I met veterans. I met people who were actually involved in those battles, who had survived and who were in their 80s and 90s, and who you'd be surprised how robust their memories had been. They remembered the moments of the battle, what happened at that point of time in 1967, which helped me pen down the stories. And I'm grateful to all of the sources who I spoke with. So the story actually essentially, and Farooq said, the story is in 67, it actually starts from 1965. The reason why that happened is that, after 1962, India was on a back foot, given that it had suffered a debacle against China. It was not very well prepared. The political and military morale was low. So the adversaries in the subcontinent, China and Pakistan, were looking to punch holes and wrest their psychological advantage or create a greater psychological pressure on India in the mid-1960s. There was also a very active CIA in India at that point of time. And they used to operate in Delhi. They used to be in Northeast, in Kalimpong, in Sikkim, and elsewhere. So what happened, and this is where the book starts. The book starts with the story of this gentleman called Duane Claridge. Duane Claridge was a CIA agent who was in India, posted in Delhi. He had met with an Indian politician who called him to Jeddah to share an important secret, a very key piece of information. When he landed up in Jeddah and met with the Indian politician, and I will not name the Indian politician, it is there in the book. I would let you read the book and then savor the entire story. But I'll tell you what happened there. So when he met this Indian politician, he revealed a secret that was quite dangerous. That was an important piece of information. And when he heard it, when Duane Claridge heard what was told to him, he was stunned. He then called up his CIA headquarters in Langley. They said, we know about this. It just confirms what we knew. Now, what was this piece of information? We all know, I mean, if we go back in history, we all know there was a war between India and Pakistan in 1971. There was a war between India and Pakistan in 1965. That war happened in September 1965. In March 1965, the CIA in Langley in the US was actually running a war game. And they were talking about a scenario where Pakistan and China were in concert acting against India, and they would attack India in the September of 1965, which is what exactly happened in 1965, that September, when Pakistan attacked. Now, we know about the India-Pakistan war on the Western Front. What we do not know is that China and Pakistan had acted in concert. The plan was this, that Pakistan would move its forces covertly and incite the local population against the Indian government and cause an uprising. And then in round two, will push their classical military forces into Srinagar, capture Srinagar, roll down to Jammu. And while they did that, the Chinese would knock on the doors of Sikkim and would roll into Gangtok, capture Sikkim. The objective of these two strikes in the north and in the east was twofold. One, to stretch the Indian defenses. The second, more importantly, the higher cause was to politically to the negotiating table where Pakistan would take Kashmir in exchange for China moving out of Sikkim. So there was a barter that was planned that, this is how we'll get India to the table, that, okay, you want us to move out of Sikkim, the Chinese to move out of Sikkim, you would have to agree to give away Kashmir to Pakistan. So that was the aim with which China had and Pakistan had acted. The benefit was simple. China would continue to mount the psychological pressure and gain that and regain the psychological advantage it had had over India in 1962. So therefore, this was the plan. And but the plan came unstuck because Pakistan couldn't move much in 1965, and India attacked, and India moved into Lahore, and other things happened, and Pakistan was on a back foot. So that's a separate story. But because this didn't happen, China couldn't make its moves in Sikkim. However, while the war was on the Western Front in 1965 between India and Pakistan, which all of the media focuses on, there was something that was happening at the doorstep of Sikkim and Tibet, the Sikkim-Tibet border. Sikkim at that point of time was not a part of India. It was a protectorate state, and India has to look after its defenses. So Sikkim, being a protectorate state, China, it was vulnerable to. So China believed that it could actually push India and push India back from Sikkim, from the heights that it occupied at the borders, on the borders of Sikkim. China mounted different kinds of pressure. And one of the interesting things that happened at that point of time was that one fine day on the 26th of August, if I'm right about the date, if I can recall correctly, The Chinese accused India of stealing 800 sheep and 59 yaks. Now, you'll be surprised that it is even an issue between two countries, but China did. And it was such a serious allegation, which might seem, worthy of mirth and laughter. But the fact is, China said India has stolen our sheep and yaks, and they exchanged very serious allegations, which seemed like China was willing to go to war because of their sheep having been stolen. India also responded to Chinese allegations, and it became they traded allegations, they traded accusations at each other. In the Indian Foreign Office even said that, all those yaks and sheep that have come are free to go back to China if they want to. So it somewhere became very funny and serious at the same time. There was one politician, a 42-year-old politician, who would later become the Prime Minister of India, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who decided to deal with it slightly differently. He decided to gather 800 sheep in Delhi and do a protest march to the Chinese embassy with the slogan that, with the sheep, there was a slogan held up by the Indian protesters: eat us, but don't go to war. So it was only Mr. Vajpayee who could do that, who could think differently and out of the box, and have a witty repartee to what was happening in a very boring manner, diplomats exchanging blows and accusations at each other. So this is something that he did. He led a march of 800 sheep to the Chinese embassy in 1965. So the matter ended because Pakistan and India, we know that Lal Bahadur Shastri and Ayub Khan went to Tashkent, and there was an agreement. And so India had gained an upper hand in 1965 in the war, so China couldn't do much. But at that point of time, there was something else that China was trying to do. China was trying to knock on the doors of Sikkim and occupy the heights. Now, what happens is, So sorry, this is. I also wanted to take a look at this. The western side, the India-China border runs from J&K to the east, and if you see the western side where you have had the disputes of Galwan, etc., that is one area of dispute that India and China have had over the years. I should have shown this slide slightly earlier, but you can take a look at it now. And the middle sector is the least controversial sector. Eastern sector has always been controversial. China claims a large part of Arunachal Pradesh. And at that point of time, China claimed Sikkim. This map is from the time of Doklam in 2017. So, you can see the Doklam trijunction of Bhutan, India, China also given there. So Sikkim also was contentious at that point of time. And you have over 4,000 kilometers of Indo-China boundary, out of which a lot of the boundary is under dispute. On the J&K side, there's Aksai Chin, which has been occupied by China since 1950s, but I'll not go into that. I just wanted you to get a sense of how the India-China border moves, and where is Sikkim in terms of India and China and the dispute. So Sikkim was a protectorate state, and at that point of time, China believed that Sikkim was to be a part of them, and that is where they were trying to gain a foothold. So this is Dwayne Claridge, who I spoke about. I spoke about the CIA spy. I spoke about the Indian politician and what was happening in Jeddah, which led to the back channel negotiations and all of the secrets that were being traded. The Indian politician, incidentally, was a very important politician. You'll read about him in the book. When he called up the Indian, the foreign ministry and said, look, I know of this secret. And how did he come to know of it? Because Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, had told him about this secret. But when he told, and there were certain Pakistani agents who subsequently told him that, we would need your support in Kashmir. He was a Kashmiri politician. You would know who I'm talking about. But when he came back to India, he was arrested by the government and sent to Ooty for 8 years. We don't know what happened. He claims that he had told the Indian government that this is the plan in 1965. Somehow that remains a mystery as to what happened. Did he actually tell the Indian government? And did all of this happen, which he claimed that he had actually divulged what he had learned from Pakistani agents and Mr. Cho La, the Chinese premier. But that was then, that was 1965. I'll come back to what China was attempting. China was attempting to gain a foothold in the heights of the Himalayas. Yeah, so this is the sheep stir that happened, and Atal Bihari Vajpayee led a sheep march to the Chinese embassy and protested against the Chinese accusations. This is where I was, that China wanted to occupy the heights of Sikkim. The reason why they wanted to occupy the heights of Sikkim, and one of the places was the border outpost of Nathula and Jelepla. Now, there was a meeting that was held between the Corps commander. The Corps commander, the Corps looks after the entire area, and he had called the commanders in the area would call them division commanders and others before the 1965 war took place. And what was discussed was that if China mounts pressure on India, India would withdraw from the heights. Now, sitting in 2022, we'd wonder why India would agree to such a ridiculous plan. But the fact is, at that point of time, there was a lot of psychological pressure that was there on politicians as well as senior military leaders. So India had decided internally that if there is a Chinese pressure, so we would move from the heights, move back, and form our defenses in depth. Now, the Chinese wanted to sit on the heights and then dictate terms. So when China mounted pressure on India to move back from Nathula, the pass that was there in Sikkim, that is still there in Sikkim, occupied by India, one man defied his own leadership as well as the Chinese threats. It was General Sagat Singh. General Sagat Singh was the division commander of 17 Mountain Div. That was a Sikkim division. And he decided to stay put at Nathula, despite the Chinese pressure, and despite the fact that the Indian leadership wanted him to move back. So he stayed there because here was a decision dilemma that lay before him. Should I stay back, or should I follow the rule book which had been agreed at our end by my bosses? So he defied his bosses. He said, no, I will stay back, because if I were to move back, if I move my border outpost of Nathula back into Indian, into the lower heights, the Chinese would sit atop the heights. And this is what would happen, as you can see on the map, that the Chinese would roll down to Sikkim and could dominate this Siliguri corridor. What would happen then is that Siliguri corridor, as you can see in one of the maps to your right, is basically a narrow corridor known as the Chicken's Neck, which connects mainland India to Northeast. At that point of time, what you see is Bangladesh was not Bangladesh, was East Pakistan. So the Chinese could link up with the East Pakistani troops and cut off India's Northeast if they were to occupy Sikkim, which you see on the slightly blown up slide picture. Sikkim is between Nepal and Bhutan, that little portion that is there, the narrow portion. So if they were to occupy that, they would cut India out. That was General Sagat's decision. General Sagat decided to take a higher call to protect the territorial integrity of the country, and he stayed put. That singular tactical decision, defying your own bosses, defying the Chinese, proved to be absolutely crucial in history. Because in 1971, when India and Pakistan went to war, China could not move its troops to protect or to come to the aid of Pakistan. There were several other reasons. One of the reasons is that General Sagat decided to stay put at the heights of the Nathula, of the border at Nathula, which prevented China from coming in and occupying Gangtok, which could have actually resulted few years later, 1971, we all know about the India-Pakistan war in Bangladesh. The question is, why did China not come to the aid of Pakistan in that war? The reason, amongst several other reasons, one of the reasons is that General Sagat did not budge from his position in 1965. Otherwise, the Chinese would have come and settled in Gangtok or Sikkim and would have threatened India. So this is General Sagat and his, you can see one of the slides, he's standing with his men at Nathula. The other one is there with the Sunnis. He's a tall general, one of the greatest generals that India has had, one of the greatest generals the world has had in the last century. He was, I don't have time, otherwise, there are several stories about General Sagat. General Sagat was the one general who was responsible for the liberation of Goa and integration of Goa, as part of India. He had led the forces in the capture of Panaji in 1961 as a brigade commander, as a brigadier. And he had defeated the Portuguese forces there. 1967, he had defeated the Chinese, and he would go on to capture Dhaka in 1971. He's one of the greatest generals. Mrs. Gandhi once told him, and this is what I learned from his EDC, is that Sam, which is Sam Manekshaw, who we all know about, Sam got me Bangladesh, you got me Dhaka. So that is something that General Sagat was very well known for. His action plan, his blitzkrieg, his ability to lead in a battle. He was somebody who is highly regarded in Indian war history. So 1965 led to many things. Between 1965 and 1967, the Chinese juggernaut became bigger. The Chinese juggernaut, in terms of it being a military power, became much bigger, much stronger. China became a nuclear power, tested its nuclear capability thrice, and in a span of 3 or 4 years, which was the quickest in the world. The Chinese also enhanced its military. It also started to create problems within India. It started to fund the northeastern militancy during this period. It was also responsible for funding the rise of the Nakshal movement in Naxalbari in 1967. So all of these things were happening between this period from 1965 to 1967. Because the Chinese were miffed that India was actually standing up to it. And that was the first time that India had stood up to the Chinese when General Sagat pushed them back in 1965. There were a lot of events that was happening with tussles between India and China. One of the incidents that happened in early 1967, which almost led the two countries to a war. What happened there? So there were two diplomats, young diplomats, Indian diplomats, K. Raghunath and Ravi, who were in Beijing and who one day set out to tour some of the older temples and the older tourist destinations in Beijing and take photographs and pictures of various places. They suddenly found somebody following them and they were taken into custody. The Chinese accused Indian diplomats of spying, of espionage. One thing led to the other. They were brought to a public court and they were flogged. India responded immediately. Mrs. Indira Gandhi arrested a few Chinese diplomats in the Chinese embassy, and the entire Chinese embassy was put under arrest. There was also, furious mobs outside the Chinese embassy. I have it in the book. You can read about that more, how the Chinese officials were injured because the mobs went in, destroyed the compound, and the Chinese officials were also, so it became a free-for-all. The Chinese put a siege to the Indian embassy in Beijing and put Indian diplomats under house arrest. India did a tit for tat. there was a deadlock. And when you have embassies under arrest, it's very difficult to really find a way. So the two countries were hurtling towards a war. Finally, and the Western nations were very much worried. But finally, peace prevailed and things were settled, but only for that time being. Things were simmering under the surface. Finally, things would go down south in Nathula. Where else? Because that is where things had been simmering for a while, since 1965, since the presence of General Sagat, who had stood up against the Chinese. General Sagat decided to lay a boundary wire, a barbed wire at Nathula, which irked the Chinese, because the Chinese would come in every time there were incursions. So General Sagat said, no more incursions, we'll have this barbed wire put in there. You can, when you go to Nathula, up from Sikkim, you can see the barbed wire that still exists today. So General Sagat had put that in place. While he was getting the barbed wire to be put in place, there were scuffles that started to happen between the Chinese and Indian troops. The Indian troops of 2nd Grenadiers Regiment, the 2nd Grenadiers Battalion of the Grenadiers Regiment, was at Nathula, one of the companies, about 120 odd men, but it was, operationally out about 100 men, 80 to 100 men at the post at the Nathula location, which were there. And the Chinese and the Indians started to have scuffles over the laying of the barbed wire. One thing led to the other. And on the 10th night of September 1967, General Sagat, again, his sense of timing seemed to be quite apt. He realized that something was going to give. He moved the artillery guns up close to Nathula. He made sure the communication lines were clear. He called the local field commanders, the battalion commanders, the company commanders, and made sure that everybody was in sync, because something was going to happen, given that the scuffles were taking place almost every day. And they had come to blows as well. And there were these jarts of grenadiers who had punched the Chinese commissar and broken his spectacles. And some of those things had happened, which had irked the Chinese no end. On the 11th of September, while about 20 people were, working on the barbed wire fence, the Chinese again objected, and their arguments ended in a scuffle. They traded blows, and the Chinese got beaten up again, and they went back this time. Unlike earlier times when they would go back and they would hurl accusations, this time they went back, and the Indian soldiers, 20 soldiers, led by Major Bishan Singh, who was a company commander there, were still there, still working on the barbed wire. Can I have the next slide, please? And you can see these slides during these scuffles, when these scuffles were taking place during the laying of the wire fence. The Indian and Chinese soldiers were in heated arguments, and often they were trading blows. And so they went back. And so you can see this is the cover of the book as well. On the right, you can see Major Bishan Singh trying to pacify the Indian soldier. He's alive, he's in his mid-80s, lives in Jaipur, and I got this picture from him. This is one day before the battle commenced. And this is an important photograph because some of these people did not live to tell the tale. And this happened while the scuffle was going on. So somebody took the picture, and we have it now, many years later. It's a priceless picture of that time. So the Chinese went back, and what did they do? There was silence for about 5-10 minutes. And suddenly they opened up. They opened up with their light machine guns, with their medium machine guns, and their artillery. The Indians were completely taken aback. There were bodies falling everywhere. The bullets were picking the soldiers who were out there on the watershed, working on the barbed wire fence. The bodies were falling, the people were dying, and there was, people were running helter-skelter. It was something that was unexpected. This can happen in a battle where you are surprised by the enemy, by the sudden opening of fire by the enemy. But General Sagat had also created a plan for ensuring that one is resilient. So though the Indian Army, the company there was taken by surprise and shock initially because of the sudden firing that the Chinese had opened up. And two of the officers, Captain Dagar and Major Harbhajan, they decided to charge at the Chinese. Now, when you charge, and this is again the scuffle that happened before the battle, the day before the battle. So they decided to charge at the Chinese. When you charge, and the Chinese were at a higher ground, so Captain Dagar and Major Harbhajan put together a few men, and charged at the Chinese. Now what was going to happen was the inevitable. They were cut down, they were killed. But it had given the Chinese a fair signal that the Indian army was not going to take it lying down, was going to give it back, even though they were at a position of disadvantage. For quite some time, the Chinese held the advantage, the upper hand, because they had started the firing and they were carrying on. They had caused many casualties as far as the Indian army troops were concerned. But one thing that happened was that the Chinese artillery was not being able to hit the Indian positions because they were creating a parabola and going, above the arty shells were going above the Indian and beyond the Indian positions, because the Indian positions were in a defilated space where they could be out of the parabola arc of the artillery shells that the Chinese had unleashed. There was one thing that India could not do at that point of time. India had the advantage of having its artillery observation post officers. What happens in using artillery is that, you have artillery observation post officers who can see the enemy territory, and they call the guns, the cannons which are behind, to unleash the bombardment. And those cannons then fire based on the map markings and the instructions that have been given to the cannons by the artillery observation post officers. In India's case, there were a couple of features that were occupied by artillery officers. Sheru Thapliyal, who later became Major General Sheru Thapliyal, who was sitting atop one of the features and who could see the entire Yatung Valley in China. But India couldn't open the artillery for one reason, that the permission to open the artillery was only with the army chief in Delhi, who was out of the country, and it had to be the Prime Minister's office in Delhi. Sagat asked for permission, but he realized that by the time the permission would have come, his forces would be decimated. Again, there was the leadership dilemma and the decision to make a call that is a higher call. And he had two options, either to follow the rule book and wait for the decision to arrive from Delhi, or to use the artillery and win the battle. General Sagat realized that, you take a higher call for the cause of the country over a protocol that is useless. He decided at that point of time to use the artillery. And the artillery officers at that point of time tell me how they rose to the occasion. The medium guns boomed, the artillery medium guns boomed, supported by the machine guns, the mortars, and the cannons were unleashed. There was an uninterrupted torrent of bombardment on the Chinese positions. The shells crashed down on the Chinese bunkers, and the entire road, which supplied the weapons, the supplies, was from the Yatung Valley to the Chinese bunkers, which as I said, the artillery positions could see from the feature, was completely smashed. There was an immense damage to all their equipment, tankers, trucks, bunkers. This Chinese soldiers, their bunkers, their support lines and communication and their morale had been wiped out. In 4 days, the battle ended. The Chinese casualties and deaths had been far higher. 340 were killed and over 450 to 500 injured was what the toll counted. And General Sagat had accounted for a defeat of Chinese forces at that point of time. China said, if you don't stop the battle, we'll use the Air Force. And that's where the battle stopped. But the Chinese believed that it was a flash in the pan, that General Sagat had effected a victory over them, and they just couldn't digest it. They couldn't digest it. So in 15 days, they decided to open up another front, and that was at Cho La. On the 1st of October, but this time they came up against the Gurkha troops. And this time, again, there was an argument at the border with the Gurkha troops, and the Chinese used a bayonet to butt one of the Gurkha soldiers who was there, with whom they had an argument. This resulted in a young boy, 21-year-old Devi Prasad Limbu, and you would read my first paragraph in the book is about Devi Prasad Limbu's valiant, courageous, daring action when he took out the kukri. It's a traditional Gurkha dagger. He took out the kukri and raised it to the skies, and he, slashed and swished, and he broke through the Chinese forward line of the company defenses that were there. He lopped off heads left and right, and by the time one of the machine guns had dropped him dead, he had taken out 5 Chinese soldiers, and he had more than that. He had caused immense damage to their morale right at the start of another battle in Cho La. The Chinese recovered in time, but again, what happened at Cho La was there was another young boy, Havaldar. Now he's alive. I met him. He's 80-year-old today. He had learned the use of the recoilless gun 6 months back in Mao in the infantry school. The Chinese had an advantage over India at Cho La as well. But Tinjong Lama, the person I'm talking about, he used his presence of mind and opened up with his recoilless guns to completely decimate the Chinese bunkers. By the time he was finished, the Chinese were also finished. So at Nathu La and Cho La, these are the heroes that I spoke about. Havaldar Tinjong Lama, who I mentioned, he opened up with the recoilless guns at Cho La and decimated the Chinese. I spoke about Prithvi Singh Dagar and Harbhajan Singh, who led the initial onslaught against the Chinese at Nathu La, but were cut down. Extremely courageous, valiant action. And Devi Prasad Limbu I spoke about is the picture in the bottom row. He was the one who who waded into the Chinese defenses, wielding just his kukri. So this is what happened. Now, we can say that 1967 was another battle. But 1967 is a very important battle that we must remember for various reasons. 1967 established a parity between India and China. And parity is established when you are able to record a redemptive victory. It is military victory and parity that ensures peace. Sometimes you need that. And in history, it is proved that, once you establish parity between nations, you are able to have, dialogues as equals. In 1967, it may have been a couple of small minor battles, as sometimes the Chinese narrative tries to paint it. But the impact of the battles was such that it started a series of defeats for China that followed in history. 67, China lost to India. 69, the Chinese lost to the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union, along the banks of the river Ussuri, which I also cover in the book. And what happened in 1971? I spoke briefly about how China was sort of neutralized in 1965 and 67 by General Sagar. In 1971, as Indian forces went into Bangladesh, went into East Pakistan at that point of time, the Americans, led by President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, desperately tried to push China to mount some pressure on India to move its forces. There were several reasons why they couldn't, because India had signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, and the Soviets had amassed their forces along the Soviet-China border, which meant the Chinese could not extricate their forces and put pressure on India here, as India and Pakistan were locked in a war on the Eastern Front, which was in the backyard of China. Nobody asks a question. Very few times people have asked the question as to why China did not interfere. One of the reasons is that India signed a treaty with the Soviets. The other reason is that the Chinese had suffered a series of defeats in 67 and 69, which led to the purging of the generals by Mao Zedong. And that made China a little weaker than what it would have been earlier. But Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon were still thinking that it was the Chinese forces of 1962, and which is why they were quite frustrated as to why China was not mounting a pressure on India in the war of 1971. And the third reason was that 1967 had dealt a psychological blow to the Chinese forces. And the Chinese forces did not believe in even posturing at that point of time, given that they had been given 2 consecutive defeats at Nathula and Cho La. And those defeats were playing in their minds in terms of posturing opposite Sikkim, despite the several pleadings by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. So the importance of an event or an event of that nature is not just at that point of time. Is not just measured by what happened at that point of time, but it's also important to see how it impacted history that followed. There are several other stories which I wouldn't go into, otherwise, it'd be a lot of, there are a lot of stories that I could talk about. But 87, for instance, again, India and China were locked in a standoff at Sundorongchu, again on the India-China border. At that point of time, General Sundarji took a page out of the General Sagat Singh playbook and again, mounted an aggressive move against China, surrounding the Chinese forces and forcing the Chinese forces to move back. At that point of time, General Sundarji was also asked by the foreign ministry in Delhi that, why don't you, the Chinese forces have come, why don't you move your forces back? General Sundarji's simple, so he was told by somebody in the foreign ministry, one of the diplomats, that the prime minister is not very happy about the decision that you've taken to take on China at the India-China border. General Sundarji told them, please ask the prime minister to get better advice, because he was the man on ground. To the prime minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's credit, he went to Sundorongchu and he addressed the troops. And this is what comes out of 1967 and some of those battles, that the morale of the troops and the Indian army at that point of time was so high that they could take on the Chinese, unlike what was thought in various parts of Delhi in diplomatic circles. So when the prime minister asked the troops, when he was addressing the troops, he said, "Aapko yahan rehna hai ya wapas piche jana hai?" So the troops, and this is where I speak about the high morale of the Indian Army Jawan, the soldiers, the troops, and the officers on ground. So when the prime minister asks them, "Aapko yahan rehna hai ya piche jana hai?" One of the subadars raised his hand. He stood up. He said, "Saab, हमें ना यहाँ रहना है ना पीछे जाना है, आप हुक्म दीजिए, हमको आगे जाना है." So this is just an anecdote in terms of how that shows the kind of morale that soldiers operate in the Indian Army, despite the hardships and despite the handicaps. this is how one operates, and this is the high state of morale. So this is what happened. And so the Chinese went back, and India, without firing a bullet, General Sundarji had recorded a victory over China in 1987. The importance of 1967 is that for 50 years, over 50 years, China never ever mounted an attack again. You can talk about Galwan 2020, it was a skirmish, but China never mounted a full-fledged attack ever again on India. And as I said, China has never won a war or a battle after 1967, which is what, when it started to hurtle towards a series of defeats, 67 against India, 69 against the Soviet Union, and 78, 79 against Vietnam. After that, the Chinese policy has been to posture, but never to really go to war. And it's never fought a war ever after Vietnam. And so 67 started India's ascent as a military power in the region, just as much as it started the long line of defeats that China has suffered. That does not, however, take away anything from the fact that the Chinese army is very powerful, and the China today is a very powerful global power, a very, very formidable global power. But history, when you look at how history looks at some of these incidents and the impact, this is what is a story that reveals to all of us as to which way 1967 paved the way for history, that paved the way, history of the two countries. At the end, I'll just finish here. One quick thought is that some of these stories, and there are many from history, and in my next book I talk about stories from World War I to 2008, 2009. There are stories, there are events that we ought to know about. And I also am on a journey towards discovering some of these events. 1967 was an event, a watershed in history, because it was a geographical watershed. B, it was a political watershed, because after that, the Chinese never mounted a full-scale attack on India. And I believe, the stories that we must tell everyone have a certain sense of importance. I go back to an interesting African proverb, which when translated into English means that till the lion learns to write, the story of the jungle will always be told by the hunter. India's stories in the 1960s were always written by historians who had a political bias, and therefore that helped build the American impression of 1962 and thereafter. It's important that we write our history. It's important that we read our history. And that's where I'll end, and I'll leave it to Farokh and everyone for the questions to follow. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely fascinating, Probal. How long was your book in the research stage? How long did you meet people, interview people, look at documents?
So, documents. Now, that's an important thing that you mentioned, because in India, we don't really record things as much and as well as we should. So it was a combination of recording oral history and also speaking with, people, officers and soldiers in the battalions and the units in some of these places. To answer your question, so it took me 2.5 years to do the research and the writing. And the advantage was that the sources came from 3 different streams. One was the oral sources, the veterans, and those people who had participated in either the battles or the diplomatic exchanges, or been at that time. Second was, there were some articles, some papers that had been written about 1967, which are there floating around in the internet, which also helped me. And I must be grateful to those writers and authors who have done that. The third part is data or information, which is not very well recorded in India, I must say. And that is where there's an issue. Archives are not very well maintained. They're not very easily accessible. And I've written about that as well. And we need to do a far better job of that. But that's how it was. It's an interesting journey. I started with the knowledge of maybe about 20%. And that's the beauty of the book, that, you educate yourself as well.
You mentioned the casualties on the Chinese side, Probal. What was the casualty count as far as the Indian side was concerned?
The Indian side was, if I remember, it was 88 dead and 150 injured. And the Chinese side was 340 soldiers were killed and 450 injured. So one is the numbers, the stats, and it's always a sad thing to have people dying. But here, it was important to send a strong message, one. And secondly, it caused a psychological damage. It had wrested the psychological advantage in India's favor, which India had somehow lost in 1962.
This 67 is not on people's consciousness. What do you think is the root cause for that? Why have people forgotten it? Or why is it not talked about as much as, say, Galwan or Doklam?
Yeah. So I think Galwan and Doklam is also because we are living in an age where everything is available in the instant sort of press of a button. So that's a question I've always faced in several discussions and talks. My understanding is that 1971 was a glorious victory that India had, and it whitewashed everything that came before 1971. That was one reason. It was just 4 years after 1967. Number two, I spoke with veterans who said that, when they came here and they spoke about having defeated China, it was received with a sense of,
disbelief.
Yes, because there are CIA archives that I've, plowed into, looked at what happened, and the facts that come up are a combination of sources and also CIA and US resources, American resources, etc. So there is also this thing that of disbelief, because, and this is what I always try to position this entire thing as, that take yourself back to the 1960s. The psychological makeup of the Indian political, media, and military leadership was such that the Chinese soldier was still was called a 10-foot tall soldier, which was a myth, which was broken by the events of 1967. But it was something that was prevalent. The third reason, and this is more as a scholar, I believe, that when wars are engaged in by politicians, they're recorded much better in history. When wars are fought at the military generals level, they're not as well recorded, because the constituency that benefits is far lesser. I mean, it's a far smaller constituency. So by this, I mean that the political involvement in 1967 battles were far less. It was General Sagat and his band of troops that defeated China. Now, India and China hadn't had relations at that point of time. So they continue to do so. Continue to sort of, not have any relations. It's only in 1969 that the Chinese premier reached out. But this is something that I've seen as a recurrent sort of trend, that, and 1971, again, very glorious. We have seen wars and battles as one belonging to the political ambitions of the premiers. And it's not just India or elsewhere, it's everywhere. But where the battles and wars are fought and won by military leaders, the chances are that they may not be recorded very well, because they may not be highlighted as much in the political sphere. And that's where, historians or the media doesn't record it as well. That was one of the reasons I felt, it just fell through the cracks. And also, the fourth reason is that if you research on 1967, you will find that, from 1962 to 67, there had been changes in the Indian political leadership. Mm-hmm. And Mrs. Gandhi was far more she would be very aggressive to any Chinese intent. And I spoke about the diplomatic tussle. There was also Doklam in 1966. That's the first time it happened. And when Chinese forces came into Doklam, Mrs. Gandhi went to the media and said, "We're going to throw out the Chinese forces." So there was an intent that was very different. However, the more you research on 67, the more you see the weaknesses of 1962, both in terms of the political leadership, which was inept, and the military leadership, which is no less inept. So I think that was a change that had happened and that's why I start with 1965, because India had become far more, decisive in the way they acted in that war against Pakistan in 1965, and also against China that in the exchanges that followed. So the more you open up 1965, the more a lot of things tumble out of the closet of 1962. Given that Mrs. Gandhi, and this I'm talking about the political ramifications, that Mrs. Gandhi was continuing to be the prime minister thereafter. I suppose nobody really wanted to look back too much at how 1967 was essentially an improvement on a huge improvement on 1962, and nobody really wanted to talk about it much. I'll tell you, 1965, the war against Pakistan was not recorded much, was not spoken about much till recently, till some years back. And it took us a long time to even talk about that war, where we had done well. So I think there are several reasons, and I think it's not just one reason, but a combination of the reasons, which I allude to. I mean, as a scholar, I would think that these are the reasons, but somebody else might think differently.
There's a very overarching question from Varun Sharma. He says that Henry Kissinger has tried to help India, and even Manmohan Singh has described him as a friend of India. How do you see India's relationship with America now and its future?
I think to your first question, Henry Kissinger has been a diplomat all through, and he's one of the finest diplomats. He's written such wonderful books on diplomacy. He got the whole thing wrong in 1971. He got it wrong because he was backing the wrong entity, A. He was depending on the wrong entity, which was China. And and this came from a book that had been given to Kissinger and Nixon when they visited China. And that book was Neville Maxwell's book, India's China War. And that book made a huge impression. And that was a book about 1962. And that's one of the reasons why I say that, history must be written. And because the power of a book in driving foreign policy is immense. And that's how that book gained, drove their understanding of China and India, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, which is surprising given that Henry Kissinger is a learned man and he's a giant of a diplomat, but he got it wrong in 1971. So he's been a friend of India, we can say that. But when push came to shove, he was not one. He was not one, and there are recordings of what Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon spoke about Mrs. Gandhi. I do want to talk about that. I think very foul language they used, and there are CIA tapes available. There are White House tapes available, about 800 hours of White House tapes, and I listened to a few hours of that for the book. The White House tapes record what the two gentlemen, how they thought about Mrs. Gandhi, and they spoke about her in the most derogatory terms. Number one. So I think he's been a fair weather person. I mean, he comes in, he goes out, but he's been, later on, he must have sort of been more friendly towards India, but at that point of time, he was certainly not. He sided with the adversary. Coming to your second part of the question, I think things have changed a lot from then on, as far as India and the US is concerned. The two powers are concerned, So over a period of time, the Soviet Union has gone away. China is a new power. The relations are far better. Over a period of time, what has also happened is there are certain, India still sees US with a dint of suspicion because of the historical stance that America had taken, not just in 71, but also in the 90s with respect to Pakistan and the rise of terrorism. So I think that kind of cast its shadow, which is going away, which has gone away over the last couple of decades. And India and the US are far closer. I would think there are two large democracies. And at that point of time, India was a socialist power. India opened up its market. So I think there is a lot more give and take here. There is also a necessity. When you look at the political side of things, the coming together of the two nations and Japan and Australia as part of the Quad is also the necessity that drives them to be together. The necessity of taking on China in this region, or the emergence of China, brings the US and India together. And I think that is one of the things that will make them stay on one side, on the same side of the divide. Also, I feel, with the Soviet Union, with the Russian aggression and Russian invasion of Ukraine, what's going to happen is the Americans would like to believe that it opens up the weapons and arms market in India for the American companies. And the American political strategy is always driven by their trade and commerce considerations. And that's where I think it has more areas of working together, and given that there are much lesser areas of friction as it used to be in the earlier times, when the US thought that India could be a satellite of the communist network. But that suspicion is gone. So I think there are far greater things to be.
Siddharth Javeri wants to know if the Chinese have occupied any territory in Ladakh recently, which is not acknowledged.
See, I think this is a question that again has a deeper answer, has a more as a descriptive answer. I won't go into all of that, but in 1950s, China occupied Aksai Chin. Let's understand what you see as the map of India is not the map of India. We do not have a part of India which is Aksai Chin, which was occupied by China in the mid 1950s. It's only so the Chinese gave India a map in 1959, wherein they claimed a large part of the territory. There are areas which the Chinese have occupied from an earlier time. It's not that they have occupied today. So what happened was there were certain areas where the Chinese would patrol and Indians would patrol. The Chinese occupied some of these places. Yes, China has a part of the Indian territory, which is shown to us in the map as Indian territory. It's certainly not with us. Let's get that straight. And also, there is also sometimes this whole thing about Aksai Chin is today a part of China. It's been in part of China from the 1950s. So when you say, has China occupied territory? Yes, China has occupied territory. China has occupied territory for the last 50 years. And, there are certain areas near Ladakh, around Ladakh, where the Chinese and Indian patrols would come and go. But the Chinese have made incursions. And if you look at there's a larger game at play. I find this very interesting, the rise of Xi Jinping, and I speak about it and write about it several places, about how Xi Jinping's arrival has increased the number of friction points with various people, including India. So the number of standoffs that have happened in the last 8 years under Xi Jinping is greater than the collective number of standoffs that have happened in the 40 years that preceded India-China relations. So you can gauge how Xi Jinping wants China to become a world power. Xi Jinping wants to become bigger than Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping wants China has this 100-year plan. They started in 1949, wants to be the center of the global universe, the global power axis until 2049. Xi Jinping wants to have it in 2030. Obviously, there are going to be a lot of friction points, including Taiwan, which is again a different subject. But yes, China wants to keep India pinned to the Himalayas and not let India play a greater role in the region is the larger story. And that's why you will continue to see these friction points in Himalayas, which are more of a tactical outcome of the larger strategic impulse that drives China to take on India. Yeah, and keep India pinned here, not let India interfere in its larger plans, which is the South China Sea and elsewhere.
Going back to 67, Pratibha wants to know if this was a spur of the moment decision due to tempers flaring amongst the men, or was it authorized by political leaders?
Yeah, great question, Pratibha. But I must tell you one thing, the Chinese don't do anything by impulse or instinct. They are always planning to do something which is an outcome of a larger aim, of a higher. So 1967 happened. This is a question that has often been asked, that, whether it was a result of tempers flaring. That time when the Chinese opened up was also an outcome of several scuffles, it had been continuing for a few days. And before that, in 1965, when General Sagat stood up to them, they had been licking their wounds, and they wanted to, they would always talk about, and they had loudspeakers, and during those times. Today too, at the border, Chinese have loudspeakers. Nothing has changed. But they used to have those loudspeakers, and they would announce in those loudspeakers in chaste Hindi that to the Indian soldiers that aapko khana nahi mil raha, aapko theek wo nahi mil raha hai, because they would they believed in a very oversimplified way that, look, this is the way to really neutralize the aggression, the morale of the Indian soldier. So they would do that, and they were planning from the 2 years that preceded 65, 66, 67. If you see the events that happened, the funding of the Nakshal movement, the funding of the Naga movement, the Mizo movement, all in that period of 60s, that all of that happened by design. And I spoke about the diplomatic fracas, the tussle that happened between India and China happened a few months before this, the battle. So if you look at it, it all came to a boiling point. Yes, it may have been impulse at that point, but the Chinese were ready. No one opens up at the border in such a big way unless it has been ordered from the top. And no one opens up the second time in Chola. So, there was the Chinese were waiting, and they would, every time they would talk about teaching India a lesson, which is still, some of the Chinese, very aggressive Chinese stances reveal that, how they're constantly thinking about, having that kind of dialogue with India where they're completely on the aggressive. And this was in 67 also, they would talk about teaching India the lesson of 1962. It all goes back to China wanting to maintain the pressure. Where they came unstuck was they had taken on the wrong Indian general, and I think that paved the way for history to be quite different than what they thought it would be.
So as we head to our last few questions, Commander Mohan Narayan wants to know if 67 played a role in the Sikkim's accession to India. Did 67 influence Sikkim's merger with India in 75?
I actually didn't speak about it. It's there I've written about it in the book, that, the Research and Analysis Wing, RAW, which is India's premier external intelligence organization, like the CIA in the US, was formed in 1968. There was a gentleman called as R.N. Kaur who founded the RAW. And there's a book about him known as The Cowboys, KAW. And R.N. Kaur advised Indira Gandhi after 1971 that this is there in several books written by diplomats and generals who served in that period in Sikkim, that the threat to Sikkim, the threat to India remains through the corridor of Sikkim, given that Sikkim was a protectorate of India. And also, I didn't speak about Hope Cook, who was the princess, who was the queen of Sikkim. Farooq, you spoke about the Princess of Kapurthala. Hope Cook actually came from Manhattan, and she became a queen in Sikkim, and her wedding was attended by most of the state heads of the world in Gangtok. in early 1960s. And so why I'm talking about this is that the royalty in Sikkim had turned against the government. The royalty in Sikkim, Hope Cook and her husband, Palden Thondup, who was the king of Sikkim, were very close to General Sagat and the Indian army. Somehow they couldn't get along with the civil administration and the politicians in India. Initially, they were very close. Palden Thondup's father was very close to Jawaharlal Nehru, but Palden Thondup and Hope Cook fell out of favor when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was the prime minister. And so they had, Hope Cook had gone to Europe and would often write against India, write against the Indian government. So that sullied relations. The Chinese actually reached out to Palden Thondup, trying to make peace with them. India was vulnerable towards a lot of these things that were happening. The Raw advised that, Sikkim be a part of India. Several other things started to take place there. And there was a local movement of Gurkhas against Bhutias. So all of those things happened. And finally, Sikkim. But, when to your question, does 67 influence it? I think 67 ignited the vulnerability, the possibility of a vulnerable front being reopened at some point of time. So India wanted to close it, is how I would look at it. It may not have directly influenced, but it opened a possibility which led to thinking that, look, Sikkim, the Chinese, we fought 2 battles with the Chinese, and Sikkim still not part of us. So should we close that story?
The last question is on a philosophical/moral note. India's values and strategies that it has never attempted to occupy any other country's territory. Juhi wants to know if there are some hidden stories of attempted takeovers that we don't know of. I don't know if you'd include Sikkim in that.
Well, Sikkim is seen, yes, I think, what tends to happen is Sikkim is either, that's a good question, because Sikkim is seen by either side, by both sides. I mean, if you look at it, Sikkim can be seen as a territory that acceded to India, that became a part of India. The other side sees Sikkim as having integrated into India. So, that is something that we can debate about. One of the things that I would like to look at this question slightly differently, is that, when in Tibet, let's talk about Tibet then. 1913, the Tibetans had driven the Chinese away from Tibet. From 1913 to 1949, Tibet was an entity that was not recognized by the United Nations, neither by India. The Chinese came and sat in Tibet and said, this is our territory. In 1950, when Chinese came and sat in Tibet, a question arose between Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and Pandit Nehru, that should we call that out? And so there were a lot of debates going on at that point of time that, look, this is around 49 when the Chinese were coming in, and Patel wrote a letter as well in terms of how we should be careful, and we should and this was a warning to India. So when we look at Sikkim, and when states look at territories, they also look at it from their own strategic interests. I do understand that, we can look at it as a territory that became a part of India, whether it should have been a part of India. Well, we can also look at Tibet, which is not in the question of which doesn't figure in many debates across the world, but Tibet is actually an occupied territory. Had China not occupied Tibet, would India have occupied Sikkim? I would like to, probably look at it that way as well. So there are several questions, and it's a debate that will go on. Would Sikkim have been a part of India had 67 not happened? That's again a question. So, as nations expand, and China has always expanded. China is one country that's become bigger from the time it became a full-fledged nation in 1949. And unlike China, and So China has occupied Aksai Chin, has occupied Tibet. I think India has lost territory in Aksai Chin. That's how I would look at it. India has gained Sikkim in 1975. Now, as I said, that debate would go on. The questions could be many. Normally, states, it depends on whether you're a politician or a diplomat or a historian. You would look at it, or how you would want to look at it. But today Sikkim is one of the most well-governed states, how I would look at it. Whether Sikkim, and this is again something that you read in the book. This was one way to look at your question is somebody had commented that will Sikkim ever be able to retain its independence sandwiched between two mighty powers? That is a question that we could possibly ask, that could Sikkim have remained independent? Again, a question. The question that we ask of, any thought on Kashmir or any thought on a small nation or any, Bhutan is barely managed, and that's because of several other reasons, which I don't want to go into. But Tibet, for instance, is a great example of how it couldn't. So yes, would Sikkim have remained independent had India not gone in and taken Sikkim? Is a question that might have a separate debate on it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Probal. That was really illuminating, and that's evident in all the questions and all the appreciation which has come in, from incisive to lots and lots of adjectives being used. We can print these out and send these to you if you like. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and thank you very much to the audience for being with us on Saturday.
Thank you. Pleasure.